The man in the Brooklyn cell on January 3, 2026. United States Special Operations Forces launched a pre-dawn raid on Caracas that would reshape the political landscape of South America. THEIR target was Nicolás Maduro, and they found him inside the FuerteTiuna military complex, the most heavily guarded installation in all of Venezuela. Within hours, the man who had controlled this oil-rich nation for over a decade was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, heading north in American custody. His first appearance in a United States courtroom came 2 days later in Manhattan, where federal prosecutors laid out their case against him. The charges were severe and carried mandatory sentences that could keep him locked away until he dies. Conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism, large-scale cocaine importation, and weapons offenses involving machine guns and explosives. Cilia Flores, his wife and the former First Lady of Venezuela, faced the same courtroom and the same accusations. Both entered not guilty pleas, and both were ordered held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, pending further proceedings. The international reaction was immediate and divided, with some nations calling the operation a lawful arrest of an indicted criminal and others denouncing it as a violation of sovereignty. But regardless of how governments chose to frame the events of that January morning, one fundamental reality remained unavoidable. The military operation succeeded because the economic foundation of the Maduro government had already crumbled beyond repair. And generals who once pledged their loyalty to the regime offered minimal resistance when American forces arrived. And the reason for that cooperation comes down to simple mathematics. Venezuela possesses more proven oil reserves than any other country on Earth, yet the economy contracted by 80% under Maduro's watch. Understanding how that happened reveals why the arrest became possible at all. Swimming in oil, drowning in debt beneath Venezuelan soil, lies 303 billion barrels of proven crude oil, the largest reserve of black gold that exists anywhere on this planet. Saudi Arabia holds less, and the United States does not even come close. This underground wealth transformed Venezuela into one of the most prosperous nations in Latin America throughout the 20th century. The standard of living that matched European countries, and a per capita economic output that placed it in the same category as France. But extreme resource wealth creates its own kind of trap. Economists refer to this condition as Dutch disease. And the mechanics are straightforward. Massive oil revenues pour foreign currency into a national economy and push up the value of local money. When your currency strengthens, buying goods from other countries becomes remarkably cheap. Local farmers cannot compete with agricultural imports that cost a fraction of domestic production. Factory owners shut down their operations because foreign manufactured goods arrive at prices below what it costs to make them locally. Venezuela gradually abandoned its own productive capacity and became entirely reliant on petroleum revenue to purchase everything the population needed. When Maduro assumed power in 2013, oil sales generated 96% of the foreign currency entering the national economy. The country had transformed itself into nothing more than a resource extraction operation with borders. Making matters considerably worse, the state petroleum company PDVSA had been gutted from within over the previous decade. Following a worker strike in 2002, Hugo Chavez dismissed roughly 19,000 engineers, geologists, and technical experts from the company payroll. These individuals possessed the specialized knowledge required to pull heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, keep pipelines functional, and operate refineries without catastrophic failures. Their positions went to government supporters who demonstrated political reliability but possessed no relevant technical background. The research and development arm of PDVSA hemorrhaged 80% of its staff during these purges, effectively destroying the company's capacity to solve complex operational problems. Other oil-rich nations recognized these dangers and prepared accordingly. Norway established a sovereign wealth fund that has accumulated more than $1 trillion in assets. Venezuela accumulated nothing, and when petroleum prices eventually crashed, the government discovered that the national savings account was completely empty. Missing billions during the oil boom years of the early 2000s, Venezuela entered into a series of massive financial arrangements with China that would later devastate the nation. These loan foil agreements brought approximately $60 billion into Venezuelan government accounts, with repayments scheduled to come through petroleum shipments over the following decades. Officials promised that this money would fund infrastructure projects to modernize the country and reduce dependence on crude exports. The Tanaco-Anico Railway stood out as one of the most ambitious of these projects. A high-speed rail line designed to connect central Venezuela with the eastern regions. China Railway Group won the contract for $7.5 billion. And construction launched with speeches about national progress and economic transformation. That railway was never completed. Rusting tracks stretch across parts of the Venezuelan countryside today, leading to stations that were never built, while the billions meant for construction disappeared into government accounts and never came out again. Corruption during this period reached levels that are difficult to put into perspective. Jorge Giordani served as planning minister until 2014 and saw the government books firsthand throughout the boom years. He later stated publicly that approximately $300 billion had simply been stolen. Independent auditors managed to confirm that PDVSA alone lost at least $11 billion to theft between 2004 and 2015, but the actual total was certainly higher than what could be documented through official records. Global petroleum prices started falling sharply in mid-2014, dropping from over $100 per barrel down toward $40 over the following months. Countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia had accumulated massive financial reserves specifically to survive these kinds of market downturns. Venezuela had done the opposite. The National Stabilization Fund, which existed precisely for situations like this one, contained less than $3 million when the crisis hit. All those Chinese billions were gone, the oil revenue was collapsing, and Maduro found himself running a government that was essentially broke. Million% collapse governments facing severe budget shortfalls have two basic options available to them. They can reduce spending to match their reduced income, which means cutting programs and services that citizens depend on daily. Or they can print additional currency to cover the gap, which creates devastating consequences of its own. When petroleum revenues collapsed in 2014, Maduro chose the printing press and stayed committed to that decision for years. The central bank began expanding the money supply at rates that no stable economy could survive. Month after month, the quantity of bolivars in circulation grew by 20 to 30%, pushing currency into the market without any productive economic activity to support it. Inflation responded exactly as economic theory predicts, accelerating beyond anything Venezuelans had experienced in their lifetimes. The statistics from this period document a currency in freefall. Annual inflation stood at 56% when Maduro took office in 2013, which was troubling but still manageable for ordinary families trying to plan their expenses. By 2016, that figure had climbed past 800%. And by 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated that prices were rising at 130,000% per year. Some calculations for early 2019 put the annual rate above 1 million%. Steve Hank, an economist at Johns Hopkins University who tracks hyperinflation episodes around the world, ranked the Venezuelan collapse among the worst currency disasters ever documented. Ordinary transactions became exercises in absurdity under these conditions. Shopkeepers stopped printing prices on their merchandise because the numbers would be outdated within hours. Restaurants gave customers menus without any prices listed, since the cost of a meal could double between ordering and finishing. Workers spent their wages immediately after payday because holding on to bolivars meant losing purchasing power by the minute. The government responded by removing zeros from the currency, creating the Bolivar Fuerte and later the Bolivar Soberano and Bolivar Digital. 14 zeros were eliminated across multiple redenominations, but these surface-level changes solved nothing. By the time the printing slowed, the Venezuelan currency had lost 99.99997% of its value. The basic financial confidence that allows an economy to function had been systematically destroyed. The exodus when an economy collapses as thoroughly as Venezuela's did, food becomes scarce almost immediately. The combination of worthless currency, vanished imports, destroyed domestic agriculture, created conditions that researchers documented with growing alarm. A major university study conducted in 2016 found that nearly 75% of the population had lost weight voluntarily over the previous year, with the average loss reaching approximately 19 pounds per person. This was not a fitness trend. Families were skipping meals because grocery stores had nothing on the shelves. The government responded by creating CLAP, a program that distributed cardboard boxes of basic food items directly to households. Officials presented this as emergency relief for a suffering population. In reality, it became a tool for political control that kept millions of Venezuelans dependent on handouts for survival. Families who supported opposition candidates found their boxes arriving late or not at all. Neighborhoods that voted against the ruling party discovered that delivery trucks experienced mechanical problems that week. Food became a reward for obedience and a punishment for dissent. Corruption ran through every level of the program. Officials imported low-quality products, sometimes items unfit for human consumption, while billing the government at premium rates. Alex Saab, a financial fixer for the regime, allegedly ran schemes that siphoned millions from food programs while children fainted in classrooms from malnutrition. By 2019, more than 94% of Venezuelans lived in poverty, and 80% of households could not consistently access adequate nutrition. Faced with these conditions, people made the only rational decision available to them. They packed whatever they could carry and left the country. The Venezuelan exodus eventually reached 7.9 million people, representing 25% of the entire national population. This outflow surpassed the Syrian refugee crisis at certain points. Yet there were no bombs falling on Venezuelan cities and no foreign armies crossing the borders. Economic policy alone drove this mass departure. The exodus devastated professions that require years of specialized training. Doctors who once earned respectable salaries watched their monthly pay drop to the equivalent of $6 American dollars as hyperinflation consumed their earnings. Thousands of physicians relocated to neighboring countries where they could actually feed their families. Engineers who understood how to maintain oil extraction equipment moved to Alberta, Canada, where companies needed their expertise with heavy crude operations. This pattern repeated across every skilled field until the country lost the workforce needed to keep basic systems running. Those who remained faced brutal decisions about how to get out. Hundreds of thousands walked through the Darien Gap, one of the deadliest jungle crossings on Earth, knowing that many who attempted the route did not survive. The journey claimed lives regularly, but staying behind meant slow deterioration under a government that used hunger as a control mechanism. The blackout on March 7, 2019, electricity failed across Venezuela. The outage began in the late afternoon and spread through 23 states within hours, cutting power to nearly the entire national population. What should have been a temporary disruption lasted 5 to 7 days in most regions, and the aftermath exposed how badly the country's basic systems had deteriorated. The collapse started at the Guri Dam, hydroelectric facility responsible for generating roughly 80% of all electricity consumed in Venezuela. Concentrating that much generating capacity in one location creates obvious vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities had been growing worse for years. Brush and vegetation along transmission corridors had not been cleared since 2016, and fires sparked by the overgrowth eventually knocked out critical power lines. When the main system went down, thermal backup plants could not compensate because fuel shortages had left most of them inoperable. Maduro appeared on television and accused the United States of launching a cyber attack against the dam, naming Senator Marco Rubio as one of the conspirators. Engineers who worked at the facility dismissed this explanation immediately, noting that the control systems at Guri have never been connected to the internet and cannot be accessed remotely. The actual cause was routine maintenance failure on a massive scale. Corpoelec, the state electricity company, had lost half its trained workforce to emigration as wages collapsed. A $5 billion grid modernization program launched in 2009 delivered almost nothing because officials diverted the money into their own accounts. The human cost accumulated quickly once the power stopped flowing. Hospitals lost the ability to run incubators, ventilators, and dialysis machines. Medical workers watched patients die because life-sustaining equipment had no electricity. Water treatment and pumping stations across the country shut down simultaneously, leaving millions without access to clean drinking water. Desperate residents in Caracas resorted to collecting water from the heavily polluted Guer River. The petroleum sector suffered permanent damage as well. Venezuelan crude is heavy and must be heated continuously to flow through pipelines. When pumping stations lost power, the crude cooled and thickened into a tar-like consistency that clogged infrastructure throughout the system. Repairs cost an estimated $2.9 billion and reduced extraction capacity for years afterward. The narco state. By 2019, Maduro confronted a basic problem of arithmetic. The currency he had printed into worthlessness could no longer pay for even basic government operations, so he made a decision that contradicted decades of socialist rhetoric. He quietly allowed the American dollar to circulate freely throughout Venezuela, dropping controls that his government had previously enforced with criminal penalties. This policy shift created two separate economies operating within the same borders. Roughly 5% of the population gained access to foreign currency through family connections abroad, government contracts, or involvement in smuggling operations. These Venezuelans shopped at stores called bodegons, which stocked imported goods ranging from European chocolates to American electronics. The other 95% continued earning in bolivars and fell further behind economically each month. Inequality measurements during this period reached the highest levels recorded anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. But dollars alone could not keep the regime functioning. As legitimate revenue collapsed, the government turned increasingly toward criminal enterprise. Military officers who wore sun insignias on their uniforms became involved in cocaine trafficking through networks that investigators labeled the Cartel of the Suns. The Department of Justice later acknowledged that this was not a formal organization with a clear hierarchy, but rather a patronage system in which powerful officials enriched themselves through drug proceeds. The corruption extended beyond narcotics. Maduro opened the Arco Minero, a mining zone in the Amazon region larger than Portugal, to extraction operations that answered to no regulatory authority. Criminal groups, including Colombian guerrillas, gained access to gold deposits, using mercury to separate precious metal from ore and poisoning rivers that indigenous communities relied upon for drinking water. The extracted gold moved through unofficial channels to buyers in Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, generating off the books revenue for regime insiders. In March 2020, the United States Department of Justice unsealed an indictment charging Maduro with narcoterrorism conspiracy and offered a $15 million reward for information leading to his capture. That bounty eventually increased to $50 million, the largest amount ever placed on a sitting head of state. In June 2025, Hugo Carvajal, former intelligence chief known as El Pueblo, who had been extradited from Spain, pleaded guilty to all charges and agreed to cooperate with American prosecutors building their case against Maduro. The stolen election in October 2023. Representatives from the Venezuelan government and opposition parties gathered in Barbados to negotiate an agreement that offered a genuine opportunity for resolution. The terms were straightforward. Maduro would permit competitive elections with international observers present, and in exchange, the United States would ease economic sanctions that had been crushing Venezuelan commerce for years. Both sides had reasons to accept, and for a brief period it seemed possible that political transition and economic recovery might arrive together. The election took place on July 28, 2024. Opposition parties had united behind Edmundo Gonzalez, former diplomat who became the consensus candidate after authorities banned the more popular Maria Corina Machado from running. Turnout was strong across the country, and by evening the opposition had assembled a data collection operation unlike anything attempted in previous Venezuelan elections. Volunteers organized into 58,000 groups stationed at polling locations throughout the country. And as voting concluded, they photographed the official tally sheets that each electronic voting machine produces. By the end of the night, opposition leaders had collected documentation from 85% of all precincts. The numbers on those sheets showed Gonzalez receiving approximately 67% of votes cast compared to 30% for Maduro. Verification came from respected international sources. Terence Dow, a Fields Medal-winning mathematician, analyzed the official results announced by electoral authorities and identified statistical patterns consistent with fabricated numbers. The Carter Center, which the government itself had invited to observe the proceedings, reviewed the opposition documentation and confirmed it was authentic. Political scientists who studied Latin American elections described the fraud as among the most blatant the region had witnessed in decades. Maduro responded by declaring victory without releasing any precinct-level data to support his claim. Security forces arrested protesters who gathered in the streets, and opposition leaders faced threats of imprisonment. Gonzalez eventually fled to Spain after authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. The economic consequences followed immediately. Sanctions relief was revoked. Foreign investors who had been cautiously exploring opportunities in Venezuela abandoned those plans entirely. Maduro had been offered a legitimate exit from international isolation, a chance to restore oil revenues and begin rebuilding. He chose instead to hold on to power through blatant fraud, confirming to governments around the world that no negotiated solution would work while he remained in charge. The verdict: throughout late 2025, cracks appeared inside the Venezuelan military establishment. Officers who had remained loyal to Maduro for years noticed that their payments were arriving late. And when the money did come through, the amounts were smaller than promised. Gold mining operations that had funded regime insiders were producing less as international pressure mounted. Drug shipments that once moved freely through Venezuelan territory faced increasing interception by American naval patrols stationed in the Caribbean. The $50 million bounty on Maduro forced a difficult question on every general and bodyguard in his inner circle. Continuing to protect the president meant risking arrest, asset seizure, and potential decades in an American prison cell. Cooperating with American authorities offered the possibility of amnesty, negotiations, and perhaps keeping some portion of accumulated wealth. In November 2025, the United States designated the Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist organization, expanding the legal tools available for prosecuting anyone connected to the regime. When American Special Operations Forces arrived at FuerteTiuna on January 3, 2026, the resistance they encountered was minimal. Years of economic destruction had stripped Maduro of the loyalty that once protected him. The generals who might have fought to defend him had already done the math. The damage from the Maduro years adds up to one of the worst peacetime economic collapses ever recorded. Venezuelan GDP fell from $482 billion in 2014 to approximately $44 billion by 2025, a contraction of 80% that exceeds the American Great Depression, the fall of the Soviet Union, and even the destruction caused by the Syrian civil war. At the worst point of the crisis, more than 90% of Venezuelans lived below the poverty line. Nearly 8 million people left the country entirely. The Bolívar lost 99.999997% of its value through hyperinflation. Analysts who study post-crisis economies estimate that Venezuela will need between 20 and 30 years to recover. Restoring oil production to previous levels would require at least $53 billion just to prevent further decline, with another $65 billion needed for infrastructure repairs. The engineers, doctors, and skilled workers who fled during the crisis will not return quickly, and many will never return at all. Maduro now sits in a Brooklyn detention facility awaiting trial on charges that could imprison him for life. But the numbers told his story before any courtroom proceedings began. Ran an economy into the ground so thoroughly that his own protectors eventually concluded he was not worth protecting.